How do you defeat a man who has already destroyed the biggest army Rome ever put in the field? Hannibal had crossed the Alps, beaten Roman commanders again and again, and at Cannae, left the ground, soaked with Roman blood. Rome had lost so many men that survival itself was now a question. This video was made possible by NordVPN. Click the link in the description for an exclusive deal with 4 extra months. Head to the merch store for character pins, calendars, and more. And if you have ever needed a tiny, pocket-sized symbol of vengeance, the exclusive Hannibal figure is available now at oversimplified.youtooz.com. It is limited, so once it is gone, it is gone. Now back to Rome panic and the terrifying question sitting in front of the Senate. How do you solve a problem like Hannibal? After Cannae, Rome was shaken to its core. Hannibal had not just won a battle. He had wiped out the largest Roman army ever assembled, possibly killing a huge portion of Rome's military-aged men. Romans were dying by the tens of thousands. Families waited for news. The city feared that Hannibal might appear at the gates any day. In moments like this, Romans often turned to religion. If disaster was this big, then surely the gods must be angry. And if the gods were angry, someone had to be blamed. In the panic after Cannae, 2 Vestal virgins were accused of breaking their sacred vows. The punishment was horrifying. They were buried alive. The men accused with them were beaten to death. That was Rome's first response to the worst military disaster in its history. Appease the gods, punish the guilty, and then try to find an actual solution. The real solution began with manpower. Rome needed a new army, and it needed one fast. But Hannibal had just slaughtered the army Rome had trusted to end the war. So the Romans lowered the age of conscription. They enlisted teenagers. They enlisted slaves with the promise of freedom. They even armed men with whatever weapons and equipment could be found. Rome was scraping together everything it had. The city prepared its walls. Everyone expected Hannibal to come. But in Hannibal's camp, the mood was very different. His soldiers had just helped create one of the greatest battlefield victories in history. They expected the next move to be obvious: march on Rome. Hannibal did not do it. He believed Rome would surrender. From his point of view, that made sense. He had destroyed Roman army after Roman army. He had killed or captured tens of thousands of men. He had shattered Roman confidence and turned many southern Italian communities toward his side. In most ancient wars, a disaster like Cannae should have forced negotiation. So Hannibal waited for Rome to accept reality. Rome refused. Even when Hannibal offered to ransom thousands of Roman prisoners, which was normal in ancient warfare, Rome refused to pay. The prisoners could be sold into slavery before Rome gave money to the enemy. That told Hannibal something brutal about the opponent he was facing. Rome did not surrender just because it lost battles. To defeat Rome, you had to break it completely. If even one Roman army could still be raised, the war was not over. Hannibal's choice not to march on Rome became one of the most debated decisions of his life. One of his own commanders is said to have told him that he knew how to win a battle, but not how to win a war. But Hannibal may have had reasons. His army was built for movement, surprise, and destruction behind enemy lines. It was not necessarily equipped for a massive siege against one of the most fortified cities in the world. And after Cannae, many southern cities were defecting to him. He may have believed his strategy was already working. Why risk everything attacking Rome if Rome's allies were beginning to fall away? So Hannibal stayed the course. Unfortunately for him, Rome had finally learned the lesson Fabius Maximus had been trying to teach before Cannae. Fabius had argued that Hannibal was too dangerous to face directly. The Romans hated that idea. It felt cowardly. Rome's instinct was to march straight at the enemy and crush him. Then Cannae happened. After that, Fabius's caution looked much less ridiculous. Fabius became the most influential voice in Rome, even when other men held the office of consul. His strategy returned: do not fight Hannibal in a major battle. Avoid him, contain him, wear him down, attack his allies, cut off his options. Rome could lose battles against Hannibal, but it still had deep manpower discipline and a political system stubborn enough to keep going. Hannibal, meanwhile, was far from Carthage, living off Italian territory and dependent on keeping allies loyal. So Rome turned Hannibal's prize into a trap after Cannae. Southern Italian cities that joined Hannibal expected protection. Hannibal needed their support, but he could not be everywhere at once. The Romans raised new legions and spread them across the south. They attacked defecting cities here, there, and everywhere. When Hannibal approached, Roman forces often withdrew. When he left, they returned. This forced Hannibal into a constant game of Roman whack-a-mole. He had to run around southern Italy trying to rescue allies, encourage more defections, and keep his coalition from falling apart. The southern cities began to understand the danger. Joining Hannibal looked exciting when he was winning huge battles. It looked much less exciting when Roman armies arrived later to punish them. If Hannibal left southern Italy, those cities might surrender back to Rome, so he could not leave. But if Rome refused to fight him, he could not win another crushing victory. The Romans had muzzled him. With Hannibal contained for the moment, Rome could look beyond Italy. The Second Punic War was not only happening around Hannibal. Fighting had spread across several fronts. Some went badly. In 216 BC, Rome sent an army north to punish the Celtic tribes that had joined Hannibal. As the Romans entered the Latana forest, the Celts sprang a trap. They had prepared trees to collapse onto the marching Roman column. The ambush was devastating. The Roman force was destroyed and the commander's head was taken and used as a ritual drinking cup. So, not ideal. But elsewhere, Rome did better. Sicily became a major front. After Cannae, political chaos in Syracuse caused the city, a longtime Roman ally, to switch sides. Carthage landed forces, hoping to retake the island it had lost in the First Punic War. Rome sent Claudius Marcellus to besiege Syracuse. The siege was difficult because Syracuse had one of the most famous mines in the ancient world, Archimedes. Archimedes designed machines to defend the city. Roman ships were threatened by strange devices, including a giant claw said to grab and damage ships. Ancient stories even describe mirrors that could set ships on fire, though that part is debated. The Romans struggled to take the city. Carthaginian forces tried to help Syracuse, but disease devastated them. Then, inside the city, a major religious festival created an opportunity. The defenders celebrated. The Romans attacked. Marcellus took advantage of the confusion stormed Syracuse, and the city was plundered. He reportedly ordered that Archimedes be captured alive. But in the chaos, Roman soldiers found the old mathematician focused on his diagrams. According to one famous version, Archimedes refused to stop working on his circles. A soldier killed him. Rome did not save Archimedes, but it did secure Sicily by 210 BC. It also put down a Carthage-backed rebellion on Sardinia. These were Roman successes. There was also trouble in Greece. After Cannae, King Philip V of Macedon saw Rome bleeding and thought it might be a good time to join Hannibal. He was already concerned about Roman expansion in Illyria, so he formed an alliance with Carthage. Hannibal hoped this would bring real pressure against Rome. But Rome responded by sending forces to the region and stirring up Philip's Greek enemies. Instead of becoming the decisive ally, Hannibal needed Philip was kept busy in Greece for most of the war. That was another Roman success, even if it was not a clean one. But the most important front, outside Italy, was Spain. Spain was Carthage's treasure chest, its silver mines manpower, and cities made it the closest thing Hannibal had to a deep base of support. If Rome could take Spain, it could weaken Carthage and cut Hannibal off from the reinforcements he badly needed. At the beginning of the war, the Roman consul Scipio had been supposed to go to Spain, but when he realized Hannibal was crossing the Alps, he rushed back to Italy and faced him at Ticinus. After recovering from his wounds, Scipio continued the original plan and joined his brother in Spain. Together, the Scipio brothers fought against Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal. For several years they had success. They won battles. They took important ground. They even captured Saguntum, the very city whose destruction had helped start the war. For Rome, Spain began to look promising. A pattern was forming. Whenever Rome fought Hannibal directly, disaster followed. But whenever Rome fought Carthaginians, who were not Hannibal, the results were usually much better. Maybe the way to beat Hannibal was not to attack him in Italy. Maybe the way to beat him was to destroy everything supporting him. And for that, Rome would need someone different. Someone bold, young, ambitious, and willing to think like the enemy. That man was Scipio the Younger. He was the son of Publius Scipio, the consul wounded at Ticinus. He came from one of Rome's most prestigious families. Not much is known about his childhood, though later stories tried to make him look reckless and dramatic. But during the war, Scipio showed something Rome desperately needed. He had nerve. He was only 18 when the Second Punic War began. He was at Ticinus, where he supposedly saved his wounded father. He survived Cannae, one of the worst defeats Rome ever suffered. After that disaster, when some survivors spoke of fleeing Rome, Scipio drew his sword and threatened any man who would abandon the Republic. He rose quickly. Rome had lost so many men that young talent could rise faster than usual. Scipio became a military tribune. He took offices before he technically met the normal age requirements. He was young, confident, charismatic, and full of energy. Then, when he was 25, terrible news arrived. His father and uncle had both been defeated and killed in Spain. Almost all of Rome's gains there were wiped away. The Senate needed someone to take command in Spain, but almost no one wanted the job. Spain looked dangerous and unrewarding. Hannibal was still in Italy. Glory seemed to be at home defending the Republic. Then, Scipio stepped forward. He wanted Spain. The older senators were unsure. He was only 26. He did not meet the usual requirements for such a command, but he was willing, and Rome needed someone. So Scipio was unanimously elected proconsul and sent to lead the Roman armies in Spain. He wanted to do there what Hannibal had done in Italy. But Scipio did not plan to win by acting like every other Roman general. He had watched Hannibal. He had survived Hannibal, and he had learned from him. Scipio understood that marching straight at the enemy was not always strategy. Sometimes the key was the larger picture. In Spain, there were three main Carthaginian armies. Two were led by Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago. The third was led by Hasdrubal Gisco. Most Roman commanders might have focused only on finding one army and forcing a battle. Scipio looked deeper. The real key was New Carthage, the main Carthaginian base in Spain. It was the center of supplies, communication, and power. It was heavily fortified and positioned to connect with Africa. If Scipio could take New Carthage, he could strike at the heart of Carthaginian Spain. And if he took Spain, Hannibal's position in Italy would become weaker. The idea was extremely risky. New Carthage was considered very difficult to capture. It was surrounded on three sides by a lagoon and accessible mainly through a narrow strip of land. A proper siege could take months or years. Scipio did not have that kind of time. The Carthaginian armies could arrive within days, so Scipio relied on surprise. He kept the plan secret, even from many of his own men. He marched quickly and appeared before New Carthage before the enemy expected it. The city was under-garrisoned because the Carthaginians believed its natural defenses were strong enough. But Scipio had learned something crucial from local knowledge. Every afternoon, the lagoon became shallow enough to cross, so he attacked the main gates as a diversion. While the defenders focused there, a smaller Roman force crossed the lagoon, climbed the unguarded northern wall, entered the city, and opened the gates. New Carthage fell in a single day. It was a stunning victory. New Carthage fell in a single day, and with it, Scipio seized much more than a city. He captured Carthaginian supplies, weapons, hostages, and access to nearby silver mines. He also gained something just as important: momentum. The tribes of Spain watched what had happened. Carthage's strongest base in the region had collapsed almost instantly. The young Roman commander had done what many thought impossible. So, some local leaders began moving toward Rome. Scipio had not just won a siege. He had changed the political map. He was also careful about how he handled victory. Roman sources describe him as unusually merciful, compared with many commanders of his age. In captured cities, he often protected civilians and treated hostages with respect. That mattered in Spain, where local tribes were constantly deciding which great power was more useful, more dangerous, or more likely to win. Scipio understood that fear could break a city, but respect could win a region. He also allowed his men to believe he had divine favor. When people asked how he knew the lagoon near New Carthage would become shallow, the practical answer was probably simple. Local people had told him. But if soldiers preferred to believe the gods whispered strategy into his ear, Scipio did not exactly rush to correct them. A commander who looked lucky, chosen, and clever was easier to follow. The Carthaginian generals in Spain were stunned. Their capital city on the peninsula had fallen. Their supplies were gone. Their political position was shaken. And now, this young Roman was coming for them. In 208 BC, Scipio moved against Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother. His goal was to defeat Hasdrubal before the other Carthaginian armies could link up with him. Hasdrubal chose a defensive position on high ground. A typical Roman commander might have ordered a direct attack uphill and hoped discipline would do the rest. Scipio did not. Instead, he used deception and maneuver. He feigned a frontal attack, then launched an unexpected envelopment uphill. This was difficult, risky, and very unlike the old Roman habit of simply smashing forward. But Scipio had trained his army to perform more flexible movements. Hasdrubal was beaten, but he escaped Spain and headed toward Italy, hoping to join Hannibal. That was a serious threat. Hannibal had been stuck in southern Italy for years, cut off from real reinforcements. If his brother reached him with another army, the war in Italy could explode again. Meanwhile, Hannibal was growing frustrated. After Cannae, he had sent his brother Mago back to Carthage with proof of his victories. Mago poured out golden rings taken from dead Roman knights and asked for reinforcements. With enough support, Hannibal believed he could finish the war, but Carthage did not give him what he needed. Some in the Carthaginian Senate opposed sending large support. They may have been jealous of Hannibal's growing power. They may have been afraid of giving the Barcid family too much influence. Whatever the reason, Hannibal never received the steady stream of reinforcements his campaign required. Worse for him, Scipio's operations in Spain forced Carthage to divert resources there. That was exactly what Scipio wanted. By attacking Spain, he was hurting Hannibal in Italy without fighting Hannibal directly. He was cutting into the base that might have saved him. The remaining Carthaginian armies in Spain still had numbers. When Scipio moved against them, they likely outnumbered him. But again, Scipio did not rely on brute force. At the Battle of Ilipa, he delivered one of his greatest performances. For several days, both armies formed up facing each other without committing to battle. Each time, Scipio placed his strongest Roman troops in the center and his weaker Iberian allies on the wings. The Carthaginians watched this pattern and prepared for it. They expected the same arrangement when the real battle came. Then, Scipio changed everything. On the day of battle, he attacked early, forcing the Carthaginians to rush out without breakfast. When they formed up expecting Rome's strongest troops in the center, they found Scipio had reversed his line. His strongest troops were now on the wings, facing the weaker Carthaginian sides. Then, Scipio's wings stretched outward and struck the enemy flanks. His center advanced slowly, holding back the strongest Carthaginian troops in the middle. They could not leave their position to help the wings, because Scipio's center was still in front of them. So the best Carthaginian soldiers stood there, trapped by the situation while the battle was decided elsewhere. Scipio had removed the enemy's strongest troops from the real fight without defeating them directly. It was brilliant. Ilipa broke Carthaginian power in Spain. More tribes joined Rome. The remaining Carthaginian forces retreated toward the coast and eventually fled the peninsula. In only a few years, Scipio had taken Spain from Carthage. That achievement was massive. Spain had provided Carthage with money, manpower, and a strategic base. Now it belonged to Rome. Hannibal's support network had been torn away. And the strange thing was, Scipio had won partly by becoming more like Hannibal. He used the battlefield environment. He used surprise. He concealed intentions. He manipulated enemy expectations. He treated local peoples carefully to gain support. He even forced enemies into battle tired and unfed. Scipio had not just survived Hannibal. He had studied him. Some historians have argued that Scipio may have been more than Hannibal's equal, because he combined battlefield genius with a wider strategic vision. Hannibal won terrifying victories in Italy, but struggled to turn them into a finished war. Scipio looked for the structure holding the enemy together, then attacked that structure directly. While Scipio rose in Spain, Hannibal's position in Italy continued to shrink. The Romans had placed Capua under siege. Capua was the most important city in Italy, to defect to Hannibal after Cannae. Losing it would be a major blow. Hannibal needed to save it, so he made a dramatic move. He marched on Rome. For years, people had asked why Hannibal did not go straight to Rome after Cannae. Now he finally approached the city, but not because he expected to capture it. His goal was to scare the Romans into lifting the siege of Capua. The effect inside Rome was panic. Hannibal near the gates was a nightmare come alive. The phrase, "Hannibal is at the gates," became a symbol of crisis and fear. But the plan did not work. The Romans did not abandon the siege of Capua. Hannibal could not take Rome itself, so he withdrew. To the people of Capua, it looked as if Hannibal had failed to save them. The city surrendered to Rome. Capua's fall showed how effective the Roman strategy had become. Hannibal could still terrify Rome. He could still win battles. But he could not defend every ally, and every lost ally made his Italian campaign weaker. There were still moments where Hannibal showed his old brilliance. In 208 BC, he managed to ambush and kill both Roman consuls in one action. Even after years of containment, he remained deadly. But the larger direction of the war was turning against him. Then came the fate of his brother Hasdrubal. After escaping Spain, Hasdrubal crossed the Alps into Italy, just as Hannibal had done years earlier. But this time, Rome was better prepared. Before Hasdrubal could join Hannibal, the Romans caught him and destroyed his army. Then they cut off Hasdrubal's head and threw it into Hannibal's camp. For Hannibal, it was a devastating moment. His brother was dead. The reinforcements he desperately needed were gone. Spain was lost. Capua was lost. His Italian allies were under pressure. Carthage remained distant and unreliable. The noose was tightening. Scipio returned to Rome as a hero. He had conquered Spain, restored Roman momentum, and proven himself as one of the most capable commanders of the war. When the next consular election came, he ran for consul. He still did not meet all the normal age and career expectations. But Rome was no longer in a normal situation. Scipio won by a landslide. Now the question was, what he would do next. Many expected him to fight Hannibal in Italy. That seemed obvious. Hannibal was the great enemy. Hannibal was still on Roman soil. Hannibal had caused all this terror. But Scipio had a different plan. He would not attack the monster directly. He would attack the monster's home. Scipio wanted to invade Africa and threaten Carthage itself. This was the same strategic logic he had used in Spain. Hannibal was dangerous in Italy, but Hannibal depended on Carthage. If Rome threatened Carthage, then Carthage would be forced to respond. It might even recall Hannibal from Italy. Some Romans opposed the plan, including Fabius Maximus. Fabius had spent years arguing caution, and he did not like the idea of sending a major Roman force across the sea, while Hannibal was still in Italy. But Scipio believed the war could not be ended by simply containing Hannibal forever. Rome had to take the initiative. Still, an African invasion would need allies. One of the most important military advantages Carthage had enjoyed throughout the war was Numidian cavalry. These horsemen had helped Hannibal win battle after battle. If Scipio could gain Numidian support for Rome, he could remove one of Carthage's greatest strengths and use it himself. Numidia was divided between rival kings. In the east was Syphax, who had shown sympathy toward Rome for much of the war. Scipio visited him to secure an alliance, but at the same time, the Carthaginian general, Hasdrubal Gisco, also arrived to compete for Syphax's support. Syphax listened to both sides. By Roman accounts, Scipio was charming and persuasive, but Carthage had another tool marriage. Hasdrubal Gisco offered Syphax his daughter. Syphax chose Carthage, so Scipio turned to Syphax's rival Masinissa. Masinissa had long been connected with Carthage, but Scipio offered him something huge. If Masinissa joined Rome, Scipio would help him defeat Syphax and become the dominant Numidian king. Masinissa accepted. That alliance would become vital. With Numidian support secured, Scipio prepared his African campaign. He raised a volunteer army, including many disgraced survivors of Cannae. These were men who had lived under the shadow of Rome's greatest defeat. Now Scipio offered them a chance at redemption. Then he sailed for Africa. For the first time in the war, the Carthaginian homeland was under direct threat. The message was clear. Carthage had sent Hannibal into Italy. Now Rome had sent Scipio into Africa. Carthage panicked. They gathered a large army under Hasdrubal Gisco, supported by Syphax and his Numidians. Scipio was badly outnumbered. But as usual, he looked for weakness, not just numbers. An opportunity came through negotiations. Syphax offered to help broker peace between Rome and Carthage. Scipio used this as a way to gather intelligence. Roman envoys visited the enemy camps and noticed something important. The Numidian camp was built from grass reeds and other extremely flammable materials. Scipio understood immediately. One night, Roman forces approached the camps in darkness. Then they set the Numidian camp on fire. The flames spread fast. Men woke in panic, many without weapons or armor. Carthaginians nearby saw the fire and rushed out to help, also unprepared. And there were the Romans waiting. Scipio turned the enemy camps into a killing ground. Hasdrubal Gisco and Syphax escaped, but their army was shattered. Scipio followed with another victory at the Battle of the Great Plains. Then Masinissa chased Syphax into his own kingdom. Syphax was captured. Masinissa seized his capital and became the dominant Numidian ruler. Scipio had taken away Carthage's Numidian support and placed it in Roman hands. Now almost nothing stood between Scipio and Carthage itself. The Carthaginians were desperate. Their armies in Africa had been beaten. Their allies were falling away. Their homeland was threatened. There was only one thing left to do: recall Hannibal. Hannibal had spent 16 years in Italy. Think about that. He had left Carthage as a boy, grown into a commander in Spain, crossed the Alps, invaded the Roman homeland, destroyed Roman armies, turned cities against Rome, and built his entire life around one mission: revenge. Italy had become almost like his second home. His whole identity was tied to this campaign. If Rome fell, every hardship would have meant something. But now, Carthage itself was in danger. Scipio had landed in Africa. He had beaten Carthaginian armies. He had taken Numidian support away from Carthage. And now he was close enough to make the city fear for its survival. So Carthage sent the order. Hannibal had to come home. For Hannibal, this must have been devastating. Spain, the kingdom his father had built, was gone. His Italian allies were disappearing. His brother was dead. The campaign he had spent nearly 2 decades fighting was being abandoned. But Carthage was his homeland. If it fell, everything was over. So Hannibal left Italy. In Rome, there was celebration, but also fear. Hannibal was finally leaving Roman soil. That was good news. But it also meant Scipio would now have to face him in Africa, closer to Carthage, where Hannibal might find new support. While Hannibal was on his way, Carthage tried to buy time. Carthaginian leaders approached Scipio for peace talks. They tried to blame the war on Hannibal, as if the city itself had simply been dragged into the conflict by one rogue commander. Scipio was willing to discuss terms. Then Hannibal arrived. Suddenly, Carthage became much less interested in peace. To Scipio, this was an insult. Carthage had asked for terms, then changed its attitude the moment its greatest general returned. The normally merciful Scipio became harsher. He began refusing the surrender of towns and instead burned and enslaved them. He was sending a message. If Carthage wanted to keep fighting, then Rome would bring destruction to Carthaginian soil. Hannibal understood what Scipio was doing. The Roman commander was trying to lure him into battle on open plains, where Scipio's Numidian cavalry would be most effective. Hannibal knew it was dangerous. But Carthage was under pressure. Its towns were burning. Its people demanded action. Just as Roman hotheads had once rushed into Hannibal's traps, Carthage now pushed Hannibal toward Scipio. So Hannibal marched out. The teacher and the student were about to meet. Before the final battle, Hannibal and Scipio rode out from their camps and spoke face to face for the first time. It must have been one of the strangest meetings in military history. Hannibal, the old master of battlefield deception, who had terrified Rome for years. Scipio, the younger Roman who had studied him, copied him, and now brought war to Carthage itself. Hannibal warned Scipio about fortune. At the beginning of the war, Hannibal had seemed unstoppable. He had crossed mountains, won huge victories, and stood over the wreckage of Roman armies. But now look at him, older, weakened, called home, and fighting to save the city that had failed to support him properly. Fortune changes fast. He suggested peace. Scipio refused. From Scipio's point of view, what was left to negotiate? Rome had taken Spain. Rome had won in Africa. Rome had Numidian cavalry on its side. Carthage was vulnerable. If Scipio risked battle now, he could end the war completely. So, the two greatest commanders of the war prepared for the Battle of Zama. Scipio addressed his army, which included many survivors of Cannae. For those men, this was more than another battle. This was redemption. Years earlier, they had watched Hannibal destroy the largest army Rome had ever fielded. Now they stood in Africa with a chance to avenge that shame and become masters of the war. Hannibal's army was different. It was larger in infantry, but not as unified. Many of his troops came from different backgrounds and did not share the same language or experience. His best soldiers were the veterans who had fought with him in Italy, but he had to build his plan around a mixed force. The battle opened with Hannibal's elephants. He had around 80 war elephants and sent them forward to smash into the Roman infantry. If they broke the Roman lines, Hannibal's troops could exploit the chaos. But Scipio was ready. He had adjusted the Roman formation, leaving lanes between the maniples. When the elephants charged, Roman light troops made noise through missiles, then stepped aside. The elephants saw open paths in front of them and ran through the gaps instead of crashing directly into the main line. Some panicked and turned back into Hannibal's own cavalry. Scipio had neutralized the first weapon. Then the cavalry battle began. This time the roles were reversed from Cannae. At Cannae, Hannibal had held the superior cavalry and used it to surround the Romans. At Zama, Scipio had the advantage, thanks to Masinissa and the Numidians. Hannibal's cavalry was weaker. It was driven from the field. The Roman and Numidian cavalry chased after it, leaving the infantry to fight. This may not have surprised Hannibal. He likely knew his cavalry could not win. His hope was that it would pull Scipio's cavalry far away for long enough. Because his real plan was in the infantry, Hannibal arranged his army in 3 lines. The first line would absorb the first Roman attack. The second would make the Romans fight again. The third, made up of his best veterans from Italy, waited behind them fresh and ready. The Romans crashed into the first line and broke through, but it cost them energy and men. Then they hit the second line and had to fight again. By the time they reached Hannibal's veterans, the Romans were tired. Hannibal's third line was still fresh. For a moment, his plan looked dangerous. He had used depth delay and exhaustion to wear down the Roman infantry before committing his strongest troops. Even at the end of the war, Hannibal was still Hannibal. Now the battle became a race. Could Hannibal's veterans finish off the tired Roman infantry before Scipio's cavalry returned? The answer was no. The Roman and Numidian cavalry broke off their pursuit and came back at the decisive moment. They struck Hannibal's army from the rear. That was the end. The Carthaginian infantry was trapped between Roman infantry in front and cavalry behind. The army was cut apart. Hannibal escaped the battlefield, but the war was lost. At Zama, Scipio had defeated Hannibal. The losses showed the scale of the defeat. Rome suffered several thousand casualties. Carthage lost far more, with tens of thousands killed or captured. Hannibal advised Carthage to surrender. After 17 years, the Second Punic War was over. Rome's terms were harsh. Carthage lost territory. It gave up much of its military freedom. It could not start wars without Rome's permission. Its position as a great independent power was broken. Carthage survived, but it now lived under Roman control. Scipio returned to Rome in triumph. For his victory in Africa, he received the name Scipio Africanus. He had saved Rome from its greatest enemy, conquered Spain, invaded Africa, defeated Carthage, and beaten Hannibal himself. He became one of the most celebrated men in the Republic. But politics is rarely grateful forever. Scipio was powerful, famous, and admired. That made other Romans jealous. Over time, he and his family faced accusations of corruption. Tired of political attacks, Scipio withdrew from public life and retired to a country estate by the coast. Hannibal also entered politics after the war. He tried to reform Carthage and help it recover. But factional rivalry, jealousy, and Roman pressure followed him. Eventually, the threat of arrest forced him into exile. Even in exile, He did not stop being useful to Rome's enemies. He spent his later years in the eastern Mediterranean, advising rulers who opposed Roman power. Rome never forgot him. To the Romans, Hannibal was not just a defeated general. He was a monster who had nearly destroyed them. Their hatred lasted long after the war ended. One story says that years later, Hannibal was in Ephesus when a Roman delegation arrived. Among them was Scipio Africanus. The two men met again, older now, no longer facing each other across a battlefield. Scipio asked Hannibal who he considered the greatest generals of all time. Hannibal named Alexander the Great first, then Pyrrhus of Epirus, then himself. Scipio asked what Hannibal would have said if he had defeated him at Zama. Hannibal answered that then he would have placed himself above them all. It was a sharp answer. It flattered Scipio and preserved Hannibal's pride at the same time. Eventually, around 183 BC, Rome's pursuit caught up with Hannibal. Now in his 60s and facing capture, he chose poison. According to Livy, his last words mocked the Romans for being unable to wait for an old man to die. Hannibal died undefeated in spirit, but defeated by history. The Second Punic War had taken 17 years. It had nearly broken Rome. It had produced some of the greatest battles ever fought: Trebia Lake, Trasimene, Cannae, Ilipa, and Zama. It had shown Hannibal's genius, Scipio's rise, and Rome's terrifying refusal to give up. Carthage began to recover surprisingly quickly after the war. That recovery made Rome nervous all over again. Some Romans looked across the sea and saw not a defeated city, but a threat that might one day rise again. One senator became especially famous for demanding that Rome finish the job. Speech after speech, no matter the topic, he returned to the same idea: Carthage had to be destroyed. And with that thought, the shadow of another war began to grow.